Nolan Wells. He's the 18-year-old whose death during a 4th of July boat trip to a remote Mississippi island is igniting nationwide debate. Jennifer, I want to take a moment to hear what Stephen A. Smith said about this case on Cuomo just a few days ago.
Listen, you're a dad. I'm a dad. We send our children out. And first of all, regardless of what ethnicity, regardless of what color we're talking about here, we send our children out, and you're the only one that doesn't come home alive. I'll be damned if the Chris Cuomo that I know doesn't want answers and doesn't expect answers. You know me, and I'm going to push for answers. So for no one to have answers as to what happens is when the suspicion elevates exponentially.
Seeing the video of Nolan is just so heartbreaking. He seems like such a happy kid. Now, the Daily Mail has identified a 19-year-old young woman who Nolan was last seen speaking to. Now, his friend said he chose to stay behind on Horn Island with that woman. But the woman's sister is claiming that's not true. He was ready to get back on the boat that he came on. Are all these differing accounts and a lack of understanding concerning to you?
Well, I think two things can be true at once. It makes sense that he went off to see about a girl, as they say, and that they had conversation and that he decided to go back and be with friends. So I think it's more of a timing issue rather than something that is untrue on either end. I think both can be true at the same time.
Nolan's death is going to the Mississippi grand jury. The DA said something interesting, that the evidence will not be public until the grand jury reviews it first. The DA says this is to protect the integrity of the investigation and that the grand jury will ultimately decide if someone will be charged. Jennifer, do you believe someone could be charged in his death? Is this just an accident gone terribly wrong?
Well, with what we know, in other words, review of all the surveillance information we have, with actually getting to hear from one of the witnesses, one of his best friends that was there throughout the situation, listening to the calls that were made, the Coast Guard contact, as well as the riptide situation in that area. When you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. Having said that, of course, there's going to be information. 60 witnesses interviewed. I doubt if this, from what we know, will come back with the true bill.
All right. Hopefully the families, both families, get some answers. Jennifer Coffindaffer, thank you. I'll see you soon.
There are moments in an investigation when a single document changes the conversation. Not because it answers every question, but because it forces everyone to stop and look at the evidence a little more carefully. The Nolan Wells investigation may have reached one of those moments. Over the past several days, investigators have confirmed that federal authorities continue to assist with parts of the investigation. New dispatch audio from the afternoon Nolan disappeared has been released, and Katie, the young woman believed to be one of the last people to speak with Nolan before he vanished, has become the center of another important contradiction in the timeline. At the same time, local prosecutors continue preparing the case for presentation to a grand jury while stressing that the investigation remains active and incomplete. Those developments do not tell us exactly what happened to Nolan Wells on July 4. They do something else. They tell us where investigators appear to be looking. And when you separate the confirmed facts from the rumors that have flooded social media, a much clearer picture begins to emerge. Before we go any further, it's important to establish one thing. This investigation is still ongoing. No one has been charged. Authorities have not announced an official cause of death. Several pieces of evidence remain under forensic review. That means every new document, every interview, and every recording has to be understood in its proper context, not as a final answer, but as another piece of a much larger puzzle. Nolan Wells left for Horn Island on the 4th of July with friends, expecting what should have been an ordinary holiday on the water. Horn Island, just off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, attracts hundreds of boaters during Independence Day celebrations. Families swim, groups anchor offshore, and dozens, sometimes hundreds of boats gather along the beaches throughout the afternoon. By every account, the early part of the day looked normal. Friends spent hours moving between the boats and the shoreline. Photos were taken, people talked, Others met new friends. Nothing about those ordinary moments suggested they would later become evidence in a nationally watched investigation. Then, sometime during the afternoon, everything changed. According to the accounts shared publicly, Nolan was last seen speaking with a young woman later identified as Katie McCormick. For days, very little was known about her. Rumors spread across social media. Some falsely claimed she had disappeared herself. Others claimed investigators were searching for her. Neither was true. According to statements shared through her family, Katie safely left Horn Island that evening aboard another boat and returned home. She has not been accused of wrongdoing, and those close to her say she fully cooperated with investigators. But that wasn't the part investigators found most interesting. The real issue wasn't Katie herself. It was what she reportedly remembered. According to statements later discussed by the Wells family's legal team, Katie reportedly believed Nolan intended to return to his original group before they left the island. That matters because some of Nolan's friends have publicly described something different. Their account suggested Nolan stayed behind voluntarily. Those are two different versions of the same moment. If Katie's recollection is accurate, Nolan expected to reunite with his friends. If the friend's account is accurate, Nolan chose to remain on the island after they departed. Investigators have not publicly explained how they are evaluating those conflicting accounts, but the difference is significant because it affects the timeline of Nolan's final known movements. For Nolan's family, that contradiction remains one of the most painful unanswered questions. Not because it proves anyone lied, but because only one version can accurately describe what happened. And somewhere between those two accounts lies a fact investigators still need to establish. Then, another development quietly entered the case. Federal authorities confirmed that the FBI is assisting with parts of the investigation. That announcement generated enormous attention online, with some people immediately assuming the Bureau had taken over the case. That is not what officials said. According to Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter, FBI assistance is not unusual because Horn Island falls within federal property managed by the National Park Service. The Bureau has also confirmed it is helping address interstate threats made against individuals connected to the investigation while assisting local authorities with certain aspects of the evidence, including digital material already collected. In other words, the FBI's involvement does not mean federal agents believe a federal crime has occurred. It means they are providing assistance in areas where federal resources and expertise can be valuable. That distinction matters. Because investigations often become clouded when people mistake assistance for conclusions. The FBI helping examine evidence is not the same as announcing what happened. Investigators still have to follow the evidence wherever it leads. That evidence now includes something thousands of people have been discussing over the past week: a newly released recording. Officials recently released dispatch audio from the afternoon of July 4th. The recording captures a call made from the boat Nolan's friends used that day after mechanical problems reportedly developed while they were leaving Horn Island. The caller sounds stressed. He explains that the boat is taking on water. He requests assistance from Sea Tow. He provides coordinates. He answers questions about the people on board. He declines Coast Guard assistance when asked. The recording itself confirms those details. What it does not confirm is many of the claims circulating online about voices heard underneath the conversation. Since the audio became public, countless viewers have replayed it repeatedly, convinced they can hear background conversations referring to Nolan. Some believe they hear people asking if someone is breathing. Others believe they hear entirely different phrases. At this point, none of those interpretations have been confirmed by investigators or independent forensic audio experts. Without that analysis, those background sounds remain exactly what they are: interpretations, not verified evidence. That doesn't mean the recording lacks importance. Far from it. The audio establishes an objective timeline. It documents when help was requested. It preserves the questions asked by the dispatcher. It captures the condition of the group at that moment. And investigators can compare that timeline with GPS records, witness statements, phone data, and other evidence collected during the investigation. That's how cases like this are built. Not from one dramatic discovery, but by seeing whether independent pieces of evidence point in the same direction. Meanwhile, another public statement has added to the growing attention surrounding the investigation. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath recently addressed criticism that authorities have not shared enough information with the public. Her response was direct. She acknowledged that people want answers. She acknowledged the family's frustration, but she also explained why investigators cannot publicly discuss every interview, every document, or every piece of evidence while the investigation remains active. According to the district attorney, protecting the integrity of the investigation means some information simply cannot be released until the work is complete. She also confirmed that, once investigators finish gathering evidence, the case is expected to be presented before a grand jury. That does not automatically mean criminal charges are coming. A grand jury reviews evidence presented by prosecutors and determines whether sufficient legal grounds exist for charges to move forward. It is a procedural step, not a verdict. Still, its confirmation signals that investigators believe the evidence deserves formal legal review. So where does that leave the investigation today? Authorities continue reviewing digital evidence. The FBI remains involved in a supporting role. Witness statements continue to be compared against physical evidence. The newly released dispatch audio has added another verified piece to the timeline. Katie's reported account remains one of the most important unresolved contradictions investigators must evaluate. And somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports, phone records, GPS data, interviews, and forensic analysis may be the answer Nolan Wells' family has been seeking since the 4th of July. But another piece of evidence may be even more important than the audio itself. Investigators now have records that don't depend on memory. They don't depend on interviews. And they don't depend on anyone's interpretation. They depend on something far more difficult to dispute: GPS data. And when we look at where that evidence says the boat actually traveled after leaving Horn Island, another series of unanswered questions begins to emerge. The dispatch audio answered one question. It confirmed that the group called for help after experiencing trouble on the water. But another piece of evidence may prove far more important than anything heard on that recording. It doesn't rely on memory. It doesn't depend on interviews. And it doesn't change depending on who is telling the story. It is the GPS data. Unlike witness statements, GPS records automatically document where a vessel traveled and when those movements occurred. That is why investigators often treat electronic location records as one of the strongest tools for reconstructing a timeline. According to information released during the investigation, law enforcement obtained navigation data directly from the boat involved that day. Those records reportedly showed the vessel's movements after leaving Horn Island, creating an objective timeline investigators could compare against interviews and other evidence. On its own, that timeline does not establish that anyone committed a crime. What it does provide is a sequence of movements that investigators can either reconcile with witness accounts or identify as needing further explanation. According to the available records, the boat departed Horn Island during the late afternoon. Rather than traveling directly back to its final destination, investigators say the vessel made several additional movements. The GPS data reportedly shows the boat entering Fort Bayou before returning to the dock. Later, it left again, traveled toward another area, and was eventually removed from the water before being transported over land. Those movements have received considerable public attention because many people expected a much simpler route home. But investigators have been careful not to suggest that the route itself proves wrongdoing. Boats are frequently moved several times after returning from a day on the water. Weather, docking arrangements, mechanical issues, or storage decisions can all influence where a vessel travels. The important point is not that the boat moved. The important point is that investigators now have a documented timeline they can compare with every witness interview collected in the case. That comparison becomes especially important when witness accounts differ. As we've already discussed, Katie's reported account suggests Nolan intended to return to his friends before they departed Horn Island. Some of Nolan's friends have publicly described those moments differently. Investigators are now faced with two timelines. One created from human memory, the other created by electronic records. Neither automatically overrides the other. Instead, detectives work to determine where those timelines overlap and where they don't. That's often where investigations make their biggest breakthroughs. But the GPS records are only one part of the evidence. Another object has become just as important: Nolan Wells' cell phone. According to attorneys representing the Wells family, both investigators and independent experts working with the family agreed to conduct a joint examination of the device. That agreement is unusual enough to deserve attention. Rather than having competing experts examine the phone separately and argue over their conclusions later, both sides agreed to participate in the review together. The goal is straightforward: determine exactly what information the phone contains before drawing conclusions from it. Modern smartphones preserve an extraordinary amount of information: messages, call history, photographs, location information, application activity, internet usage, timestamps. Depending on the condition of the device and the available data, investigators may be able to reconstruct portions of a person's final movements with remarkable precision. Whether Nolan's phone ultimately provides those answers remains unknown. Authorities have not publicly released the results of that examination, but everyone involved appears to agree that the phone could become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the investigation. The phone has also become the center of another public discussion. According to statements made by Nolan's family, there were concerns that certain digital activity appeared unusual. Questions were raised about missing content and differences between various location services. Those concerns have been discussed publicly by family representatives, but investigators have not announced any conclusions regarding those issues. That distinction matters. Public concerns are not the same as verified forensic findings. Until investigators complete their analysis, those questions remain exactly that: questions. Still, experienced investigators rarely ignore digital inconsistencies. Instead, they examine whether technical explanations exist before considering more serious possibilities. Applications calculate location differently. Signals can be interrupted. Data can synchronize at different times. Sometimes what appears suspicious at first turns out to have an entirely ordinary explanation. Other times, it leads investigators somewhere unexpected. At this stage, authorities have not publicly indicated which of those possibilities applies here. Another issue that continues to generate discussion is Nolan's social media activity. People close to the family have said Nolan was an active Snapchat user. According to those familiar with his habits, his activity reportedly stopped during the period investigators are attempting to reconstruct. Standing alone, that fact proves very little. Many people spend entire afternoons away from their phones, but when detectives are trying to account for someone's final hours, even routine digital patterns become relevant. The question isn't whether stopping social media activity is unusual. The question is whether it fits with everything else investigators already know. That's why digital evidence is rarely evaluated by itself. It is layered alongside interviews, GPS records, phone logs, dispatch recordings, surveillance footage, and physical evidence collected during the investigation. Every piece either strengthens the timeline or raises another question. Meanwhile, another development has kept public attention focused on the case. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath has continued emphasizing that investigators cannot publicly disclose every detail while the investigation remains active. For many following the case online, that silence has been frustrating. Rumors have filled the gaps. Videos have circulated claiming to solve the mystery. Artificial intelligence has generated fake recordings and fabricated screenshots. Names have spread across social media without verification. Investigators have repeatedly urged the public to avoid treating online speculation as established fact. That warning is worth remembering. Several widely shared claims have already been corrected after further investigation. Images believed to show Nolan after July 4th were later determined to have been taken earlier. Audio clips have been misidentified. False reports involving witnesses have spread faster than investigators could address them. Each correction reinforces the same lesson. Evidence must be verified before it can be trusted. Perhaps that's why the Wells family has continued repeating one request from the beginning: follow the evidence. Do not rush to conclusions. Their attorneys have consistently said they want a complete investigation, not assumptions, not online theories, and not premature accusations. That approach mirrors the way prosecutors typically build complex cases. Piece by piece, record by record, interview by interview. Only after every available fact has been examined do investigators determine whether the evidence supports criminal charges. According to officials, that process is continuing. The expected presentation before a grand jury represents another step in that legal process, not its conclusion. Still, one question continues to stand above every other. What happened during the final hours before Nolan Wells disappeared? The GPS records may answer part of that question. The phone examination may answer another. Witness testimony could explain the rest. Or it could expose new contradictions investigators haven't discussed publicly. One thing is certain. This investigation is no longer focused on a single witness or a single event. It is now built around hundreds of individual pieces of evidence that must fit together before the full picture becomes clear. By this point in the investigation, one thing has become increasingly clear. The Nolan Wells case is no longer centered on a single witness or a single piece of evidence. Instead, investigators are trying to determine whether dozens of independent pieces of information tell the same story. That includes witness interviews, GPS records, dispatch audio, digital evidence, phone data, and every statement made before and after Nolan disappeared. Each piece matters. But none of them, standing alone, explains exactly what happened during those final hours on Horn Island. That is why prosecutors have continued asking the public for patience. Investigations involving conflicting witness accounts often take longer than people expect. Detectives are not simply collecting evidence. They are comparing it. Every interview is measured against physical evidence. Every timeline is compared with electronic records. Every claim is tested to see whether it can be supported by something objective. That process is rarely fast. And it almost never unfolds publicly. According to officials, the next major legal step is expected to be the presentation of evidence before a grand jury. That announcement has generated enormous discussion online, with many people assuming it means criminal charges are inevitable. Legally, that is not what a grand jury does. A grand jury reviews evidence presented by prosecutors and decides whether there is sufficient legal basis for charges to move forward. It does not determine guilt. It does not conduct a trial. And it does not decide whether someone is responsible for a crime. Its role is much narrower. It evaluates whether prosecutors have enough evidence to continue through the criminal justice system. Whether that ultimately happens in the Nolan Wells investigation remains unknown. Officials have not announced what evidence will be presented, which witnesses may testify, or when a final decision will be made. That uncertainty has allowed countless theories to spread across social media. Some people believe investigators already know exactly what happened. Others believe authorities are hiding information. Neither claim has been supported by official statements. Instead, investigators have repeatedly emphasized that the investigation remains active and that many aspects of the evidence cannot be discussed publicly while the case is still under review. For Nolan's parents, however, every day without answers has been another difficult reminder of what was lost. Since the beginning of the investigation, Christine and Elmo Wells have consistently said they are not asking investigators to rush. They are asking investigators to be thorough. Through public interviews, meetings with prosecutors, and statements released by their attorneys, they have continued repeating the same message. Follow the evidence. Go wherever it leads. Do not stop until every important question has been answered. That request has remained remarkably consistent, despite the intense attention surrounding the case. It is easy to forget that behind every headline is a family grieving the loss of an 18-year-old son. For them, this is not simply another national news story. It is their everyday reality. Every new interview, every newly released document, every public statement, every rumor circulating online. All of it affects people who are still waiting to understand exactly what happened on July 4. That is one reason investigators have urged people to be careful before sharing claims that have not been verified. Throughout the investigation, several widely circulated stories have later turned out to be inaccurate. Photographs were taken out of context. Audio recordings were interpreted in dramatically different ways. Witnesses became the subjects of rumors before investigators publicly confirmed even the most basic facts. Each time misinformation spread, investigators found themselves addressing public speculation instead of focusing entirely on the evidence. Cases like this demonstrate how quickly social media can shape public opinion long before investigators finish their work. It is understandable that people want immediate answers, but investigations are built on documentation, not momentum. That brings us back to Katie. Although much of the public discussion has centered on her reported conversation with Nolan, it is important to remember what has actually been confirmed. According to statements shared publicly through the Wells family's legal representatives, Katie reportedly told investigators that Nolan intended to return to his friends before they departed Horn Island. Some of Nolan's friends have described those moments differently. Investigators now have both accounts. What they have not done is publicly announce which version, if either, is supported by the totality of the evidence. Until they do, neither account should be treated as a proven conclusion. The same careful approach applies to the dispatch audio. The released recording provides investigators with an important timeline. It confirms when the call occurred. It documents the conversation between the caller and the dispatcher. It preserves the circumstances surrounding the request for assistance. What it does not do is independently verify the claims many people believe they hear in the background. Without professional forensic analysis, those interpretations remain exactly that, interpretations. The GPS evidence occupies a similar position. It objectively documents the movements of the boat. It does not, by itself, explain why those movements occurred. That explanation depends on interviews, additional evidence, and the broader investigative picture. Taken together, these pieces of evidence demonstrate something important about this investigation. Rather than relying on one dramatic discovery, investigators appear to be building their understanding from multiple independent sources. If those sources begin supporting one another, confidence in the timeline increases. If they conflict, investigators continue searching for the reason. That is how complex investigations move forward. Slowly, methodically, Evidence first, conclusions later. It may not satisfy those hoping for immediate answers, but it is the standard expected in any investigation where the stakes are this high. As this case continues, several questions remain unresolved. Will the examination of Nolan's cell phone clarify his final movements? Will the GPS records fully align with witness statements? Will additional interviews resolve the conflicting accounts surrounding Nolan's plans before the boat left Horn Island? And if prosecutors present the case before a grand jury, will the evidence support criminal charges, or will investigators determine that additional work is still necessary? At this stage, no one outside the investigation can answer those questions with certainty. What can be said is that the investigation has entered a phase where digital evidence, witness testimony, and documented timelines are likely to carry more weight than rumors circulating online. For everyone following this case, that distinction is worth remembering. The loudest claim is not always the strongest evidence. The most widely shared theory is not always the most accurate. And sometimes the most important development is not the one making headlines, but the document quietly added to the investigative file. The Nolan Wells investigation is still unfolding. Federal authorities continue assisting where appropriate. Local investigators continue examining evidence. Prosecutors continue preparing for the next legal stage. And Nolan's family continues waiting for the answers they have sought since the 4th of July. Whether those answers ultimately come from digital evidence, forensic analysis, witness testimony, or some combination of all three remains to be seen. Until then, the investigation remains exactly what officials have described from the beginning: active, ongoing, and incomplete. As more verified information becomes public, the picture will almost certainly become clearer. But for now, the evidence tells us something both simple and important. There are still unanswered questions, and investigators are continuing the work of finding those answers. If you've followed this investigation from the beginning, we'd like to hear your perspective. Based only on the confirmed evidence discussed today, which piece do you believe investigators will rely on most as the case moves forward? The GPS timeline, the digital evidence from Nolan's phone, the witness statements, or the dispatch audio? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you found this Evidence First update helpful, consider subscribing so you don't miss future verified developments as they become public. As always, we'll continue separating confirmed facts from speculation and follow this case wherever the evidence leads.